He did not have a journalism degree. That detail alone should have mattered more than it did. For 3 decades, Martin Bashir built a career on a single skill: convincing the most guarded, most damaged, most famous people in the world to let him in. Princess Diana let him in. Michael Jackson let him in. And in both cases, what he did with that access changed the course of their lives. And in Jackson's case, it changed the course of history. He never fully answered for it. Not really. Not until June 2026, when Netflix released a 3-part documentary called Michael Jackson, The Verdict, and Martin Bashir appeared on camera again, older, quieter, talking about the man whose life his footage helped unravel, sitting alongside prosecutors, jurors, and family members, as if 2 decades of silence could be settled with a single new interview. And there are details in this story almost nobody has fully told. Let's go back to where it actually starts. Not with Michael Jackson, but with a young reporter from Wandsworth, South London, who studied English and history, not journalism, and who somehow talked his way into the most closely guarded rooms in the world. Bashir began his career at the BBC in the late 1980s, working his way up through local radio and regional television before landing a spot on Public Eye, an investigative program. He was ambitious. He was good at making people trust him. Colleagues would later describe him as someone who understood instinctively that the biggest stories in the world were not about facts, they were about access. And access required something specific. It required a subject who felt like no one else was listening to them. On Public Eye, Bashir developed a specific reputation among colleagues. He was patient in a way that unsettled people. He would spend weeks, sometimes months, simply being present in a subject's orbit before ever raising a camera. He learned their routines, their insecurities, the specific language of sympathy that made guarded people start talking. Producers who worked with him in those early years would later describe an operator who understood, better than almost anyone in British television, that the story was never really about the questions you asked on camera. It was about what you did in the weeks before the camera ever came out. In 1995, Bashir found the subject who would make his name: Diana, Princess of Wales. She was, at the time, one of the most photographed and least understood women on Earth. Surrounded by palace officials, tabloid photographers, and a collapsing marriage that the entire world was watching, Diana wanted to tell her own story, in her own words, to someone who seemed to actually care what she had to say. Bashir gave her that impression. What actually happened, as the world would not learn for another 25 years, was considerably darker. Wait, don't miss this detail. To convince Diana's brother, Earl Spencer, to introduce him to her, Bashir showed him forged bank statements. The documents falsely suggested that people close to Diana were being paid to spy on her, feeding a paranoia that made her more isolated, more distrustful of everyone around her, and more likely to turn to the one person who seemed to be telling her the truth. That person was Bashir. The interview aired on the BBC's Panorama in November 1995. 23 million people watched it in the United Kingdom alone. Diana told Bashir, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded, a line that would follow her for the rest of her life," which was tragically short. 2 years later, she was dead. It would take until May 2021, a full quarter century, for an official inquiry led by Lord Dyson to conclude what insiders had long suspected: that Bashir had acted in a deceitful manner, that he had fabricated documents, and that the BBC's own internal investigation in 1996 had been woefully ineffective at holding him accountable. Diana's son, Prince William, said publicly that the interview had substantially influenced his mother's decision to become even more isolated in her final years, and that it had contributed directly to the fear, paranoia, and downward spiral that defined the end of her life. That is what Martin Bashir's methods produced the first time. Then, 8 years after the Diana interview, he used the same methods again, this time on Michael Jackson. And now everything changed. By the early 2000s, Michael Jackson's public image had been damaged for years, first by the 1993 molestation allegations, which ended in a settlement without criminal charges, and then by a series of strange headlines about his appearance, his finances, and his private life. Jackson wanted, more than almost anything, to show the world who he actually was. Not the tabloid caricature, the real person, the father, the entertainer, the man who had built Neverland as a place where children who never had a childhood of their own could finally have one. Bashir approached Jackson's camp with exactly the pitch Jackson needed to hear. According to Jackson's nephew, Taj Jackson, who has spoken about this extensively in later years, Bashir used a letter that Princess Diana had reportedly written, praising his work as leverage, presenting himself as a journalist who could be trusted with someone's most private self because he had already proven it once with the most famous woman in the world. Jackson invited him into Neverland. For approximately 8 months, Bashir followed Jackson with a camera crew, through rehearsals, through interviews, through quiet, unguarded moments that Jackson had almost never allowed anyone to film. He filmed Jackson shopping. He filmed Jackson with his children. He filmed Jackson at his most relaxed and least defended, describing his belief that sharing his bed with children in the platonic, non-sexual way he insisted it always was simply an extension of the childhood generosity he wished someone had extended to him. Think about what it means to hand someone 8 months of your most unguarded self, believing they are building something that will finally let the world see you clearly. The documentary was called Living with Michael Jackson. It aired in February 2003. You still haven't seen the biggest surprise. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Clips of Jackson describing the bed-sharing arrangement, stripped of context and edited for maximum impact, spread across every news outlet in the world within hours. The documentary that Jackson believed would rehabilitate his image instead detonated it. Within days, Jackson released his own response, a video titled "The Footage You Were Never Meant to See," which included additional unaired material meant to show a fuller, gentler picture. It barely mattered. The damage was already done, and it was the kind of damage that doesn't reverse. Here is the detail that connects everything. The documentary directly triggered a new criminal investigation. Prosecutors in Santa Barbara County reopened scrutiny of Jackson's relationships with children, working from the assumption that if Jackson would say what he said on camera, there might be more to find. By November 2003, Jackson's Neverland Ranch was raided. By early 2005, he was standing trial on 10 counts, including child molestation, attempted molestation, and conspiracy. The trial spanned nearly 4 months, from jury selection in late January to the verdict in June. 12 jurors, 8 women and 4 men, sat through testimony from the accuser's family, former Neverland employees, and Jackson's own defense team, led by Thomas Mesereau, who argued the prosecution's case rested on a family with a documented history of pursuing celebrities for money. Character witnesses for the defense included Macaulay Culkin, who testified Jackson never touched him inappropriately, despite sharing a bed with him as a child, along with comedians Jay Leno and Chris Tucker, who described the accuser's family pursuing money and gifts independently of Jackson. I can't believe this either, but keep watching. On June 13, 2005, after roughly 32 hours of deliberation spread across 7 days, the jury returned not guilty verdicts on all 10 counts. Outside the courthouse, Jackson's fans wept and cheered. Jackson himself, thin and visibly shaken, was helped into a car and driven away without addressing the crowd. But acquittal does not undo a documentary that has already aired in 80 countries. It does not undo the years Jackson spent afterward as a recluse. He left the United States almost immediately after the verdict, first settling in Bahrain as a guest of the royal family, later moving to a rented estate in Ireland, then finally to a gated home in Las Vegas. He rarely performed. He rarely appeared in public at all. Friends and associates who saw him during those years described someone who trusted almost no one knew, who kept his circle small and closely guarded, who had, in the most literal sense, learned the lesson that opening his private world to a camera crew could cost him everything. His finances, propped up for years by loans against his music catalog, continued to deteriorate quietly, out of public view, until his death in June 2009 revealed an estate that was, on paper, hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. Think about what it means to spend the final 6 years of your life relearning how to trust no one, because the one time you did, fully and completely, it was used to help build a criminal case against you. Bashir did not disappear after Living with Michael Jackson aired. He did not face the reckoning that might have seemed inevitable for a documentary that helped trigger a criminal trial against its subject. Instead, his career accelerated. In February 2005, during Jackson's actual criminal trial, timed for maximum ratings impact, Bashir produced a follow-up special called Michael Jackson's Secret World, assembling critics and former associates, including tabloid journalist Diane Dimond and Vanity Fair writer Maureen Orth, to further shape public opinion while the jury was still deliberating. He moved to the United States. A BC News hired him, then NBC, then MSNBC, where he hosted his own program for several years. He became, by most industry measures, a successful and well-compensated American television journalist. His name recognized, his opinion sought, his past largely unexamined by the institutions that kept hiring him. And here's the thing no one ever talks about. For nearly 2 decades, the two defining moments of Martin Bashir's career, the interview that helped destroy Princess Diana's peace of mind, and the documentary that helped destroy Michael Jackson's reputation and, according to many who knew him, hastened his decline, were treated by much of the industry not as warnings, but as credentials. He had gotten the impossible interview. Twice. That was the story people told about him, for years, in newsrooms that valued access over almost everything else. Ask yourself what it says about an industry that the two most consequential acts of deception in modern celebrity journalism were, for 2 decades, treated as a resume rather than a scandal. The reckoning, when it finally came for Diana first. In 2020, an investigation by British journalist Andy Webb, the same investigative journalist who would later go on television to say plainly that Bashir's reporting helped destroy Michael Jackson's life, uncovered evidence that Bashir's methods with Diana had been fraudulent from the start. The BBC launched an internal inquiry. Lord Dyson's independent investigation followed. By May 2021, the findings were public, and they were damning. Forged documents, deceit, and a media institution that had known enough to be suspicious in 1996 and had chosen, for 25 years, not to look closer. Bashir resigned from the BBC in 2021, citing health issues. He had been serving by then as the BBC's religion editor, a quiet final chapter for a man who had once secured 2 of the most consequential interviews in the history of celebrity media. Now, everything you've seen so far means nothing, because in January 2024, the BBC released more than 3,000 internal emails related to the Bashir affair. In them, Bashir did not apologize. He blamed what he called professional jealousy within the corporation. He suggested that his ethnicity and working-class background had made him a convenient target for colleagues who resented his success. The emails also revealed that Bashir had made false allegations against Steve Davies, Princess Diana's longtime driver, accusing him of feeding rumors to the press. Davies was fired without explanation and never learned why. He lived the rest of Diana's life believing she thought he had betrayed her. In 2024, the BBC formally admitted the allegation had been entirely without foundation and compensated Davies for the damage it caused. Think about what it means that Bashir's pattern was never isolated to 2 famous women and 1 famous man. It extended to a driver nobody remembers, whose reputation was destroyed as collateral damage in a story that was never really about the truth to begin with. Davies spent years of his life believing a woman he had served loyally died, thinking he had betrayed her. A quiet, almost invisible casualty of the exact same instinct that produced Living with Michael Jackson. Find the story that will land hardest and worry about who gets hurt only after it airs. Michael Jackson never got that kind of accounting. He died in 2009, 14 years before the Dyson Report confirmed what Jackson's own defenders had argued for 2 decades. That Bashir's methods were not journalism in any traditional sense. They were a performance of intimacy, engineered to extract the most damaging possible material from people who had let their guard down because they believed, for a moment, that someone finally understood them. Here is the detail that deserves to be sat with for a moment. because it is the hinge on which this entire story turns. Jackson's nephew, Taj Jackson, has said publicly, more than once, that the letter Bashir used to gain Jackson's trust, the one reportedly referencing Diana's praise for his work, was itself a manipulation, using one act of damage to enable the next. If true, it means Bashir did not simply repeat a pattern. He used the first victim as a tool to reach the second. A woman whose trust he had already broken became, in effect, the bait for the next person he intended to break. This is what no headline ever captured. Not in 2003, not in 2005, not for years afterward, because by the time anyone had the full picture of what happened with Diana, the world had mostly moved on from Michael Jackson's documentary, filed away as old tabloid history, rather than the first chapter of a story that would repeat itself on a global stage a decade later. Consider how differently this story might have been told at the time if journalists in 2003 had known what would take until 2021 to become public record. Every review of Living with Michael Jackson, every op-ed about Jackson's bizarre bedroom comments, every solemn cable news panel debating his fitness as a parent, all of it was built on raw material gathered by a man whose signature technique, unbeknownst to anyone watching, was fabricating trust out of forged paper. Think about what it costs someone to be right about a person like this for 20 years and be dismissed as bitter, biased, or obsessive for saying so. Jackson's family and defenders spent 2 decades insisting that Living with Michael Jackson was not an act of journalism, but an act of manufactured betrayal. For most of that time, they were treated as unreliable narrators of their own sons, brothers, and father's destruction, because the man responsible had a British accent, a respectable employer, and, for a long time, no public evidence tying his 2 biggest stories together. In June 2026, Martin Bashir appeared on camera for Netflix's Michael Jackson. The Verdict, his first extended public reflection on his role in Jackson's story in years. He sat among prosecutors, defense attorneys, jurors, and Jackson family members, offering his account for a new generation of viewers who, in many cases, know more about the Dyson Report than they know about the original documentary that started everything. Ask yourself what it means that the man now being asked to help explain Michael Jackson's downfall to the public is the same man whose own downfall, engineered by his own deception decades earlier, against an entirely different, entirely undeserving woman, was only fully confirmed 5 years before he sat down for that interview. Think about the 2 families still living with what he did. Princess Diana's sons, who grew up watching their mother's final, isolated years, shaped in part by a lie they wouldn't fully understand until they were grown men with children of their own. And Michael Jackson's children, who will spend the rest of their lives answering questions about a documentary that aired years before any of them were born, built on 8 months of trust their father gave to a man who was already, provably, capable of manufacturing exactly this kind of catastrophe. Neither family got an apology that meant anything. Diana got a quarter-century of silence, then a report. Jackson got nothing at all. He was already gone by the time the world understood what Bashir's methods actually were. The ending, in the end, isn't a courtroom verdict or a corporate report. It's simpler and colder than that. Martin Bashir is still working, still being interviewed, still in some rooms treated as an authority on the very stories his own deception helped write. He never lost his career the way Michael Jackson lost his peace, or the way Diana lost the last 2 years of her life to fear she didn't need to carry. He lost a job at the BBC, the same institution that failed to properly investigate him in 1996, then rehired him for years afterward, then finally let him go in 2021 for reasons the public was told were about health before the emails revealed the fuller story in 2024. I can't believe this either, but it's worth sitting with one more time before this ends. The documents that let him into a princess's confidence were forged. The letter that reportedly opened Neverland's gates may have been manufactured too. And in between those two acts, an entertainer who had already given the world more joy than almost any performer in history was left for the final 6 years of his life, trying to rebuild a reputation that one film crew, trusted completely for 8 unguarded months, had helped take apart. He died before anyone outside a small circle of defenders understood what had actually happened to him. Before the forged bank statements were public knowledge, before Lord Dyson's report existed, before the world had any real reason to reconsider the man behind the camera instead of only the man in front of it. The verdict came out in 2026. Michael Jackson has been gone for 17 years. Diana has been gone for nearly 3 decades. And Martin Bashir is still, after everything, the one still being asked to explain what he saw, instead of finally, fully being asked to answer for what he did. Somewhere in the footage of that 2026 documentary, there is a moment where Bashir, older now, sits in front of a camera one more time and talks about Michael Jackson the way he once talked about Diana, with the practiced, careful sympathy of a man who has spent his whole career learning exactly how that sympathy sounds. Whether anyone watching in 2026 hears it differently than audiences did in 1995 or 2003 is, in the end, the only real verdict left to reach.